challenge for WestCONnex is it's not just one toll road. It's the M4 widening come through, the M4 East, you've got the new M5, plus the new M5 and M4 link. So people's behaviours across a whole range of different corridors will be impacted on by these new tolls, new toll roads, and how will they behave. And trying to model that would be incredibly difficult in getting it right with you also. The other part of the analysis we looked at was basically who we think would use WestCONnex. Forgetting about complex transport models, but who would be the punters paying the toll to use this road. And as Clover touched on before, most of the people we see travelling in from Western Sydney are coming in by public transport. So that's the most effective way for them to travel in. It's quicker, it's more affordable for them to travel through. These aren't necessarily people living next to a train station, these are people making use of park and ride. So driving to a local station, parking their car, jumping on the heavy rail and travelling in. As I said, it's very difficult to pick up people's behaviour and how they will impact different tolls. So we know that at the moment there are people travelling through on untolled parts of the M4 and M5. If you introduce a toll for them, they're not getting any additional benefit. They're not using the whole road, the new WestCONnex, but they're going to get a toll. What are they going to do? Are they going to stay on that piece of infrastructure, or are they going to get off? They're going to get off and use an untolled secondary road. Clover talked about Parramatta Road being a key driver for the strategic alignment of WestCONnex. And this is one of the early designs which came out from Instructor New South Wales. So this had a sort of a cut and cover impact for Parramatta Road. So this is sort of the WestCONnex road going underneath Parramatta Road. Parramatta Road goes from 6 lanes currently down to sort of 1 with parking, 2 lanes away. This was quickly sort of discarded through, I feel, technical reasons. Digging up Parramatta Road in this manner would create a huge challenge. But this is still what Parramatta needs. It needs the traffic taken off. It needs the traffic to be pacified. We need less lanes of traffic on Parramatta Road. And what you will see is this style of development here, this sort of medium to high density activity, which will do 2 things. It will provide more housing for Sydney. Sydney needs more housing. It will provide a corridor which has good access to the CBD plus jobs to the west. And also help grow jobs from the CBD, all those jobs are clustered together I talked about before, help them grow along Parramatta Road, out to Parramatta and further west. So it'll help link together, not just from a transport point of view, not just from a housing point of view, from an economic point of view. But this isn't what the current plan for Parramatta Road is. It will remain to be a very busy road. And just to show you how much traffic is going along Parramatta Road, these are a few volumes which are currently going along. So Parramatta Road and Taylor Street included there, 78,000 cars a day. Franklin, 101,000 cars a day. That's a lot of traffic. And Infrastructure Australia raised this point with the WestCONnex business case they reviewed about the signal-induced demand. What will happen is, if people move off Parramatta Road and go to WestCONnex and pay the toll, they'll open up road space. And what happens when road space opens up? More cars come on and fill it up. So even if people shift from Parramatta Road into WestCONnex Tunnel, more people will come and replace them. So that 100,000 cars today is unlikely to change into the future. So what are the alternatives to building more roads? So the long-term transport master plan talks about road pricing, giving people market signals to say that, hey, if you're going to use road space during a certain time of day, you should be paying for the privilege. This will send a signal to people to say, hey, this road space isn't free. The West Metro, which was a metro system from the CBD, stops at Sydney Uni, redevelopment Camellia, Parramatta, Westland. This was designed to improve capacity for public transport to the west, but also help renew Parramatta Road. What we've seen across the world is when you have metro stations, good quality public transport, that spurs much more development than roads do. More investment in general across the whole public transport network. So in the long-term master plan, the plan for growing Sydney, there's heavy rail identified, there's light rail identified, all these things have been identified, planned for, we just need to deliver them. And one of the main problems with public transport is it's hard to capture the benefits from that. But there's this thing called value capture, which is used extensively around the world. And that's basically saying, if we build a new public transport station next to your house, your property will become more valuable, and we'll capture some of that through taxing a little bit more. So if your house goes up in value by $100,000, we'll take a little of that to help pay for the project. It's very common around the world, but it's rarely used in Australia. Also, we've got to get more freight off the road, off those big doubles, and onto the existing rail network. There's the proposal for the ore bank in the modal terminal, which will bring freight from the port to this location. Will be broken down and then distributed throughout the west. Smaller, more scattered intermodal terminals around Western Sydney will help ease the freight load. But it's sort of something that's done around the world, and something Sydney has to think about more and more, getting more of its freight onto rail. This is just a little bit of thinking we did in the report about what will Sydney look like in 30 years. So, London, which is this dot density map over here, inner London around there, has a population of about 7.5 million. In 30 years, Sydney will have a population of around 7.5 million. And anyone who's been to London will tell you that the public transport, the whole transport network works very different in a city of 7.5 million as it does in a city of 4 or 5 million. So how do we get Sydney to be the size of London in the next 30 years? We need investments in high capacity public transport and changes in urban densities. So in Sydney, we've got about what's the incremental solution to the problem we have today. I'm looking forward and saying, what sort of city do you want in 30 years and how do we get to it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry. Can I just say, Terry, never apologise for being an economist. You can always tell it's an economist when they say, I really like this next cut. That was fantastic, Terry. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is on the board of Infrastructure Australia, and it was in his time on that board where he first heard of the WestCONnex project. He's a professor at Curtin University, a distinguished professor of sustainability. Very passionate on this subject. Peter Newman couldn't be here this evening, but he sent a video for us to show. He was so passionate on the subject, the original video he sent us was about the length of Lord of the Rings. The entire trilogy. So we've edited it down slightly, but here are some of the thoughts via video from Professor Peter Newman.
A couple of years we've been struggling with Sydney and its traffic and its freight issues, and trying to particularly find ways to improve the access to the port and the airport. Various proposals came in that included some of these potential roads to fix the freight. You could never get a benefit cost ratio above about 0.4, which is pathetic, and you just don't do that. So next we heard was that some grab bag of roads have been pulled together to bring cars in, because that's the only way to make the benefit cost ratio add up. This is not a great way to plan a city, because essentially what you're doing is saying, well, let's just find something that gets a higher benefit cost ratio and it must be good. Well, it'll be better, but it won't necessarily be best for the city. And that's essentially what happened. We ended up with a huge conglomeration of roads that are essentially designed to create a better benefit cost ratio, but not a better system. Who's going to go? Who's going to back this? And suddenly along came a politician called Tony Abbott who said, okay, I'll do it. I'll make it part of my roads of the 21st century. This had nothing to do with Infrastructure Australia processes, nothing about our strategic approach to building transport, nothing really about getting better economic productivity, let alone sustainability outcomes. So it was a failure as far as I'm concerned. The alternative is that you really want to build the cities of the 21st century, not the roads. because this in fact is the approach that goes back to the 1960s, it's not 21st century at all. So what's happening around the world is that cities are now competing on how walkable they are and how good their public transport is, because the knowledge economy is now the difference between cities. If you can have a thriving, productive, creative, innovative knowledge economy, then you can compete. Young people will stay and work with you. They won't go to Paris and London and New York. They'll stay in your city and they'll do creative things. But they want to live in urban situations. They want walkability. I saw a report today from Smart Growth America which shows that in Boston, 70% of the young, creative people working in the knowledge economy now live in these highly walkable areas. It's what they want in order to work. They cannot afford the time to spend on long commutes, and they must have time to come together with lots of different people in an urban situation. Cities really need knowledge economy. The roads of the 21st century are going to help the consumption economy only, and they will not help the knowledge economy. And that's a very global phenomenon. So let's get it clear that this is not some kind of green conspiracy to try and stop this road. We're talking serious economic futures for the city. But Sydney's our global city, and it really needs to keep that competitive edge. It's got a wonderful centre, which is mostly 80 to 90% of people at any time are walking. 80% of people get there by public transport. It's absolutely full as far as cars go. So if you're going to tip more traffic in there, you're just destroying it, because they won't have anywhere to park for a start. They'll just be stuck on the roads. Completely stupid to get more cars in the city centre, only where most of the knowledge economy jobs are. The new expanding parts of this knowledge economy, the bays, I went to that event, and it was very exciting to hear the New South Wales government talk about their metropolitan strategy, which was all about centres and making city centres more walkable and more public transport oriented, and I thought this is exactly what Sydney needs. And we didn't hear a word about WestCONnex West because it didn't fit in that whole strategy. The bays will be the next part of the CBD to be developed, and it is going to be like that. It has to be walkable. It has to be highly linked by good public transport. But tip more people in there with cars will ruin it. Absolutely no point. And then the rest of Sydney, including the West, has a number of centres that are doing well and want to do better. And they're going to do better with knowledge economy jobs when they get better public transport and better walkability. Parramatta's getting its light rail. Fantastic. It's a very good example of how you can make a centre in the region of the West into a really important global city. Really, the next phase is to find out how best to put money and resources and planning into improving the public transport and the walkability in the CBD, the bays, and certainly the inner north doesn't need any more roads and cars in it, and the centres. Let's get serious about providing a better future for Sydney and throw this one out.
Our next speaker is a professor with the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism. She writes for New Matilda. She's here at the University of Melbourne. Very passionate on the subject. Professor Wendy Bacon.
Thank you, Adam. And I would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and to their elders past and present. and I would like to thank the City of Sydney for the invitation to speak tonight and to congratulate Clover Moore on her magnificent leadership. She is so... that she is showing to the citizens of Sydney on this issue. Nearly 40 years ago, I was in Ultimo with the bulldozers on the day we stopped the freeway that was to plough its way through Glebe, Annandale and the inner west. And I certainly didn't expect then that I would be fighting a much bigger version of a dark 20th century idea in 2015. That project was eventually stopped by an incoming Labor government, but only after, who came on side after a huge battle by residents, activists, unionists and squatters who supported each other in those days in their battles against damaging land grabs by developers who, in the interest of profits, were hell-bent on sacrificing low-income tenants, heritage and open space.
Woo!
Some things don't change, unfortunately. Let's hope they will in the future. You've heard from people much better qualified than me why the WestCONnex is a bad idea. Not just for inner Sydney, but for the entire city. It's a bad idea in itself, but a much worse one when you consider the lost opportunities for public transport in the city and the regions of New South Wales. Tonight, I'm speaking as a journalist and a resident of inner Sydney for 48 years, and after 20 years teaching at UTS in the inner city, now with the Australian Centre for Independent Journalism as an honorary person. Now, I think the question that confronts us is this. Why is it that when independent consultants, academic transport experts, experienced transport NGOs like Eco-Transit, the City of Sydney and its independent study, other councils and thousands of residents advise that this is a poorly planned project that will lead to most people in Sydney being in a worse situation, that both major parties want to go ahead with it?
Why? Jane, yeah.
So first of all, the LNP, the Baird, previously the O'Farrell government. Just 4 years ago, it swept into power on three big issues: corruption, undemocratic planning, and yes, transport failure. Premier O'Farrell, among Baird's first step, was to set up the so-called Independent Infrastructure New South Wales, headed by none other than Nick Greiner, who after he had some of you may not know that after, and probably many of you do not know, that after he had to resign as the Liberal Premier in the early 90s, he went into the tollway business himself. Infrastructure New South Wales came up with the idea of the WestCONnex. But as Peter Newman has just explained, this was really only a revamped, updated version of an idea that Labor had been pushing on and off in different forms for nearly a decade. Once WestCONnex was announced, there was an immediate and unified chorus, you would say, in favour of it in the following days from the road and developer lobby and from the familiar sections of the media. The LNP government set up the WestCONnex Development Authority, and who should they put in charge of it but Tony Sharpe, who is the tollway company. Of course, it does other things now, like offshore asylum seekers, but as head of Transfield, it had been involved in many private infrastructure projects, including the Lane Cove Tunnel, that financially collapsed when traffic predictions turned out to be wrong. Tony Sharpe had also been head of the Big Business Lobby, the Business Council of Australia, and he'll be familiar to you as chair of the notoriously mean Abbott Commission of Audit.
Liberal donor.
Corporations have links deep into both Infrastructure New South Wales and the WestCONnex Delivery Authority. This is not the place for a detailed rundown, but the roll call of appointments includes some very senior public servants with privatisation histories. Other executives with connections to the Business Council of Australia, the HSBC Bank, Stockland, McKinsey's, There's also the person who was once the Chief of Staff for for 10 years with Peter Costello when he was Treasurer in the Howard government, a former Chief of Leighton Holdings, and I think most especially ex-executives at Boral and Adelaide Cement, both of which have major interests in road building. Now, one straw argument used to counter the attacks on the WestCONnex is that we opponents don't believe in any roads at all.
Yeah.
Now, that's something I've never heard anybody say.
That's right.
But I think that, believe it or not, most people don't think that road builders are the best people to decide our cities or transport policy. Now, a more sophisticated argument is one that the inner city has to suffer to assist the small percentage of commuters who come from Western Sydney into the CBD on the M4 each day. That's one argument. And interesting enough, it's a familiar one because last year when they wanted to close down our inner city women's refuges, they said that that was for people in the outer west and the regions too. That didn't turn out to be true. But this argument does worry me a bit. No one wants to be accused of being a NIMBY. So I decided to investigate further as a journalist and look into the first stage of the WestCONnex, which is the M4 widening. This project, which TUI announced had actually begun today, Leighton's told me last week not till May, but it was approved just 3 days before Christmas on 22nd of December, 8 days after the contract was given to Leighton's for construction. Well, look, I've been out onto the M4 and I've seen schools like Auburn North, which will be stranded between a widened M4 and Parramatta Road, literally almost on an island. I've talked to people who haven't been able to get any sensible answer from WestCONnex about why their houses weren't resumed when the immediate neighbours were. And I've actually found there's an EIS, which is quite hard to find, but it's absolutely voluminous, many hundreds of pages. Now, these days, back in the 1970s, we envisaged community consultation more as a form of participation, something that would be actually have a shape in planning. But these days, believe it or not, it usually doesn't mean that. It usually means that you decide what you're going to do, and then while you're doing the EIS, which they have done for the M4 widening, you do community consultation. And actually, there's been a large number of non-government commissions and submissions, and many people have put in submissions, including local government. And some of these are expert ones of hundreds of pages. There's a huge amount of technical data. And sometimes I wonder if politicians on either side or their minders have actually read this information. Some councils said they approved in principle, but then went on to complain about the impossibly short time for consultation. It wasn't possible for their staff to digest the information. And also, there is a large amount of extra traffic predicted to go on Parramatta Road, even by the WestCONnex Development Authority itself, which predicts that as soon as they put the tolls back on the M4, more traffic will flow onto Parramatta Road. And if anyone has been on Parramatta Road near Strathfield Station, anywhere around the mid-afternoon onwards, you will know that it's already absolute chaos. Now, the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Authority, obviously had serious misgivings about some of the technical modelling for the EIS. But they did find, the EIS did find that 3 sections of the road, yes, out in the inner west, out near Granville, Silverwater Road and other places, have been found that with the M4 widening alone, that they will have, on several spots, levels of nitrogen oxide that are above safe levels. But apparently it's not a big worry. At the end of the day, the public servants recommended 90 conditions before the M4 would go ahead. But I've talked to people in planning, public health and the EPA, and they tell me that most of the people think that the WestCONnex is a stupid idea. But such is the culture of silence and political pressure on the public service these days that we simply can't hear about this, and in the end of the day, they have to play the game. The WestCONnex planning process has been chaotic and secretive. Greens MLC Maureen Faruqi has been a constant opponent backing up the community, and Labor too. And Labor too has had some criticisms about the chaos and the secrecy. So let's now turn to Labor, which has had 4 years to develop a different vision for transport. Ironically, transport and roads are separate, both for the LNP and Labor, but nevertheless, presumably they talk to each other and can develop a new vision. And as the election approached, many waited in suspense for the ALP to announce its transport policy. The message was surely clear from the thousands of residents who've taken to the streets to say that they want to put public transport, not tollway profits, at the forefront of our transport policy. Surely the message was clear. I think younger people particularly felt that it should get through. But those of us with longer memories expected at best a WestCONnex with a twist. And sadly, we were right. If you trawl through the media from 2002 onwards, you see that the Labor government's Minister for Roads, Michael Daly, now the Shadow Minister for Roads, he was also pushing for a system of tunnels, more of their poorly planned M5 and the M4 extension, yes, right into the middle of the city. And when the New South Wales MP Greensley Rhiannon wanted to get them to reveal their plans, and plans there were, and money needed for acquisitions in the inner west, they refused. Secrecy and constantly shifting policy ruled the day then as well. So it wasn't really surprising that the first criticism you find in the ALP's transport policy from the ALP about the WestCONnex is that they're critical of the fact that the government has moved so slowly on the M4 and the M5. Perhaps in fact they're wishing that by now it would be a fait accompli so they weren't in the tricky situation they are. And several times Labor leader Luke Foley and candidates have been asked to explain their policy and why they support the M4 coming up into the city, which most people think is absurd. And they've given formulaic answers that have been repeated about taking advice from Infrastructure New South Wales. After they realise how silly that might sound, they say it will be revamped. They'll make a transport business case, but will they have in that business case what the alternatives could have been? Oh, and oh yes, they'll go for community consultation. And the narrow casting of their policy has been nothing less than embarrassing. Many feel a little insulted by suggestions that if our little patch is protected, we don't care about what happens in Chippendale, Camperdown, in the streets of Surrey Hills, Redfern or Glebe, let alone out in Homebush West.
Yeah.
Back in the 1970s, when we talked about participation in planning, we didn't imagine the distortions and strangled versions that we experience in the 21st century. And if you really were going to have community consultation, you wouldn't announce that you decided to do the project anyway. And if you were going to do a business case that was a genuine business case, you would first of all explore the alternatives and do a social cost-benefit analysis. And you'd look at the lost opportunities for public transport. But consultation is not consultation when you close off half the doors. So my answer to the question about why we don't have evidence-based transport policy in New South Wales is that we have a system through lobbying, gifts, donations and straight-out shared philosophy that could be called a case of developer capture. And since I began researching the WestCONnex, I spoke to a doctor in far west Sydney who told me that there are parents who take more than an hour to travel a couple of suburbs of public transport with young children. And I've watched old people struggling downstairs in the inner city with no lift in the stations. And if this project goes ahead, public transport users and those who can't afford tolls and short-distance commuters will still drown in traffic. But even the drivers who can afford the tollway won't be singing, as Abbott suggested last week. No, they'll be swearing, and they'll be saying that once again, politicians of the major parties have let us down. But whichever government gets in on March the 28th, it'll be up to all of us, the community, to fight this WestCONnex in all its stages.
Yeah. And we do have a small window of opportunity between March and
in March and May, because the real work, it doesn't get started till then. But one